The sirens wailed as police surrounded the playground, handcuffs glinting in the afternoon sun. 8-year-old Maya trembled behind the swing set while Karen Whitfield stood triumphant, her perfectly manicured finger still pointing accusingly. "That's the little thief," she shrieked. But as the officers approached, Karen had no idea she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, because the quiet man stepping out of his sedan wasn't just Maya's uncle. He was the one person in Willowbrook Heights who could destroy her perfect little world with a single phone call. The emergency dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio as Officer Martinez pulled into Willowbrook Heights, the exclusive gated community where lawns were measured with rulers and HOA violations were treated like federal crimes. Domestic disturbance at Maple Grove Park. Caller reports attempted theft by a minor. Suspect described as African-American female, approximately 8 years old. Martinez raised an eyebrow. 8 years old. In 20 years on the force, he'd seen plenty of calls from this neighborhood, noise complaints about birthday parties, disputes over fence heights, arguments about approved paint colors, but calling 911 on a child, that was a new low, even for Willowbrook Heights. The park sat at the heart of the community, a pristine patch of green surrounded by homes with their perfectly trimmed hedges and gleaming driveways. As Martinez approached, he could see a small crowd gathering near the playground equipment. At the center stood Karen Whitfield, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her arms crossed as she spoke animatedly to anyone who would listen. "Telling you, I saw her with my own eyes," Karen was saying, her voice carrying across the park. "She was right there by the memorial fountain, stuffing something into her backpack. When I asked her what she was doing, she ran." Behind the swing set, 8-year-old Maya Johnson crouched low, her small frame trembling as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her purple backpack sat beside her, contents spilled across the mulcha Huffington sandwich, colored pencils, a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, and a small plastic bag containing what looked like flower seeds. "I didn't steal anything," Maya whispered to herself, but her voice was lost in the growing commotion. Karen spotted Officer Martinez approaching and immediately strode toward him, her designer heels clicking against the concrete path. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. That child," she pointed dramatically toward Maya, "was vandalizing our memorial garden. I caught her red-handed." Martinez followed Karen's gesture and felt his stomach tighten. The suspect was a little girl who looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. He'd seen that look before, the wide-eyed terror of a child who didn't understand why adults were suddenly treating her like a criminal. "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what you witnessed?" Martinez asked, pulling out his notepad. Karen's eyes lit up with vindication. "I was walking my precious Bentley." She gestured to a small white poodle on a rhinestone leash, "when I noticed suspicious activity near our World War II memorial. That child was digging in the flower bed, destroying the landscaping. When I confronted her, she tried to hide evidence in her backpack and attempted to flee the scene." Several neighbors had gathered, forming a loose circle around the drama. Martinez recognized a few faces from previous calls: Mrs. Henderson with her permanent scowl, the Morrison twins who complained about everything from delivery trucks to children's laughter, and Bob Kramer, who once called the police because his neighbor's American flag was improperly folded. "Did anyone else witness the alleged incident?" Martinez asked. "I saw the whole thing," volunteered Mrs. Henderson, stepping forward eagerly. "That child has been nothing but trouble since her family moved in. Just last week, I caught her picking dandelions from the common area." "Dandelions are weeds," Bob Kramer added helpfully. "Technically, she was doing community service." Karen shot him a withering look. "The point is, she doesn't belong here. None of them do. This is a respectable community with standards." The words hung in the air like poison, and Martinez felt his jaw clenched. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where standards was code for something much uglier, but he kept his expression neutral as he approached Maya, kneeling down to her level. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Officer Martinez. Can you tell me your name?" Maya looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Maya Johnson. I live at 847 Oakwood Drive with my Uncle David and Aunt Stella." "And what were you doing in the garden, Maya?" The little girl's voice was barely audible. "My teacher, Mrs. Peterson, she said we should do something nice for Veterans Day. My daddy was a soldier before he died, and Uncle David told me about the memorial here. I thought maybe I could plant something pretty for all the soldiers who can't come home." She pointed to the scattered contents of her backpack. "I brought marigold seeds from my school's garden." Mrs. Peterson said marigolds are special flowers for remembering people. "I was just making little holes for the seeds, but then that lady started yelling at me." Martinez felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen the memorial garden many times, a small, formal arrangement of precisely placed flowers that looked more like a corporate landscaping display than a heartfelt tribute. The idea of this little girl wanting to add her own small tribute, carrying seeds in her backpack like treasure, made Karen's accusation seem even more grotesque. "Did you take anything from the garden, Maya?" "No, sir. I only brought things. I would never take anything that belonged to someone else. Uncle David taught me that taking things is wrong." Karen stepped forward, her voice rising with indignation. "Of course she's going to lie. Children lie all the time. especially children like her. Officer, I demand you search that backpack thoroughly. I know what I saw. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step back and let me handle this, Martinez said, firmly. But Karen was on a roll now, feeding off the attention and support from her neighbors. This is exactly what I've been saying at the HOA meetings. We need better screening processes. We need to maintain our property values and our community standards. We can't just let anyone move in here and let their children run wild. Their children? Martinez repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. You know what I mean? Karen said, waving her hand dismissively. People who don't understand our way of life. People who don't appreciate what we've built here. The crowd murmured agreement, and Martinez realized he was looking at something much uglier than a simple misunderstanding. This was a lynching modern and civilized, but a lynching nonetheless. A group of adults had cornered a frightened child, and were demanding justice for the crime of existing in their perfect little world. Officer Martinez, the voice came from behind the crowd.com and measured. A man approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. He was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple, polo shirt and khakis, looking like any other suburban dad except for the military bearing that showed in his straight spine and steady gait. Yes, sir? I'm David Johnson. This is my niece. He moved past the crowd without seeming to hurry, but somehow they stepped aside to let him through. Maya, sweetheart, are you okay? Maya launched herself into her uncle's arms, sobbing with relief. Uncle David, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to plant flowers for Daddy and all the soldiers. But that lady said I was stealing, and she called the police, and everyone's mad at me. David held her tight, his jaw working as he took in the scene, the scattered backpack contents. The hostile faces of his neighbors, the way they'd formed a circle around his niece like she was some kind of dangerous criminal. I know, baby girl. I know you didn't do anything wrong. His voice was gentle with Maya, but when he looked up at the crowd, there was steel in his eyes. Karen stepped forward, sensing a new target. Mr. Johnson, your niece was vandalizing our memorial garden. As treasurer of the Willowbrook Heights HOA, I have a responsibility to protect our community assets. Treasurer, David repeated slowly. That's right. And I'm telling you right now, this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the board, and I expect full restitution for any damage to our landscaping. David stood slowly, still holding Maya's hand. Officer Martinez, may I see what evidence you've collected? Martinez gestured to the spilled backpack contents. These marigold seeds, a sandwich, some school supplies, no stolen property, and the garden. I examined the area. Someone made small holes in the soil, about the right size for planting seeds. No plants were damaged or removed. David nodded, then looked directly at Karen. So let me understand this correctly. You called 911 because my 8-year-old niece was trying to plant flowers at a war memorial to honor her deceased father, who died serving this country. Karen's face flushed red. She was trespassing on HOA property. She was digging without permission? We have rules here, Mr. Johnson. Rules that everyone needs to follow, regardless of their background. The last word dripped with implication, and David's expression hardened. My background? You know what I mean? No, Mrs. Whitfield. I don't think I do. Why don't you spell it out for me? The challenge hung in the air, and Karen realized she'd stepped onto dangerous ground, but she was too invested now to back down, especially with Hal. The Willowbrook Heights Community Center buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights overhead. Karen Whitfield had called an emergency HOA meeting for 7 p.m. sharp, and by 6:30, the room was already half full. Word traveled fast in a community where gossip was the primary form of entertainment, and everyone wanted a front-row seat to what promised to be the social event of the season. Karen stood at the front of the room, shuffling through her papers, with the satisfied air of a prosecutor preparing for a slam-dunk case. She'd spent the entire afternoon crafting her presentation, complete with printed photos of the vandalized memorial garden and a detailed timeline of the Johnson family's infractions since moving into the neighborhood 6 months ago. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Karen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she held all the cards. I know it's unusual to call an emergency session, but the events of today require immediate action. The room was packed now, every folding chair occupied and people standing along the walls. Karen counted at least 60 residents, more than had attended any regular meeting in the past 2 years. She felt a surge of vindication clearly. The community was as concerned as she was about maintaining their standards. As many of you know, I witnessed a serious violation of our community guidelines today, Karen continued, clicking her laser pointer at the projection screen. The Johnson family, specifically their minor child, was caught vandalizing our World War II memorial garden. A photo appeared on screen, the memorial garden with small holes visible in the soil. Karen had taken the picture after Officer Martinez left, making sure to capture every disturbed clump of dirt. This is what our beautiful memorial looked like after the incident, Karen announced dramatically. Holes dug throughout the carefully maintained landscaping, our tribute to fallen heroes desecrated by unsupervised children. Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. I saw the whole thing, Karen. That child was completely out of control. Running around, digging up the flowers, making a mess. When you tried to correct her behavior, she became belligerent and tried to flee. Exactly. Karen nodded approvingly. And when I called for proper authorities to handle the situation, the child's guardian became aggressive and threatening. The crowd murmured with disapproval. Bob Kramer stood up in the back. I heard him threatening you. Karen said something about you not knowing who you were dealing with. Sounded like gang talk to me. Karen felt the room's energy shift in her favor. This was going better than she'd hoped. Which brings me to my main point. When we opened our community to diverse residents, we were assured they would respect our values and follow our established procedures. Today's incident proves that some people simply cannot adapt to our way of life. She clicked to her next slide, a printed copy of the Willowbrook Heights Community Guidelines, with several sections highlighted in yellow. Section 4.3 clearly states that any modifications to common areas must be pre-approved by the Landscaping Committee. Section 6.1 requires parental supervision of minors in all community spaces. Section 8.2 mandates that residents treat HOA officials with respect and courtesy. Karen paused for effect, letting the violations sink in. The Johnson family has flagrantly violated all three sections. But more importantly, they've shown a fundamental disrespect for our community standards. When confronted about their child's behavior, instead of apologizing and taking corrective action, they became hostile and issued veiled threats. The Morrison twins nodded in unison. We've always said this would happen, one of them called out. You let in one family that doesn't fit, and pretty soon the whole neighborhood goes downhill. Property values, someone else added. We have to think about property values. Karen smiled triumphantly. Exactly, which is why I'm calling for immediate action. I motion that we impose the maximum fine for violation of landscaping guidelines, $500. I further motion that we send a formal letter to the Johnson family requiring them to attend mandatory community orientation classes. The crowd buzzed with approval, but then a voice from the back of the room cut through the chatter like a knife. Point of order? Everyone turned to see David Johnson standing by the rear exit, still wearing the same khakis and polo shirt from earlier. He'd entered so quietly that no one had noticed him arrive. Maya wasn't with him, but his wife Stella stood beside him, her face a mask of controlled fury. Karen's confident smile faltered. Mr. Johnson, how, nice of you to join us. Though, I should point out that non-board members are typically observers only during official proceedings. Is that so? David's voice was calm, almost conversational. And who, exactly, makes that determination? Well, the board president, of course. Though President Harrison couldn't make it tonight, so as treasurer, I'm chairing this emergency session. David nodded slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that somehow commanded attention, despite its casualness. I see, and you called this emergency session? Under what authority? Karen's confidence wavered slightly. Under the emergency provisions of our bylaws. Of course, when community safety is at stake, any board member can call for immediate action. Community safety, David repeated, because an 8-year-old tried to plant flowers. She was vandalizing Mrs. Whitfield. David's voice didn't rise, but something in his tone made Karen stop mid. Before you continue with these proceedings, I think there are a few things the community should know. He walked slowly down the center aisle, and people shifted in their seats to watch him pass. There was something different about his bearing now, something that made the room feel smaller and more charged. First, let's talk about Maya's vandalism. Officer Martinez's report, which I have right here, David held up a manila folder, states that no property was damaged. The only evidence was flower seeds that my niece brought from her school. Marigold seeds, to be specific, which, if anyone bothered to research, are actually recommended for memorial gardens because they symbolize remembrance and honor. Karen shifted uncomfortably. The point is, she didn't have permission. Ah, yes, permission. David reached the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. That's an interesting topic. Tell me, Mrs. Whitfield, what's the procedure for requesting landscaping modifications? Well, you submit a written request to the Landscaping Committee, and they review it at the next scheduled meeting. And when is the next scheduled meeting? Karen hesitated. The committee meets quarterly. The next meeting is in December. December? So if my 8-year-old niece wanted to plant flowers in honor of her father who died serving this country, by the way, she would need to wait 3 months for permission. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. When David put it like that, the procedure seemed less reasonable and more bureaucratic. Rules are rules, Karen said defensively. We can't make exceptions just because. Just because what, Mrs. Whitfield? Just because a Gold Star family wants to honor their fallen soldier. Just because a child wants to show respect for veterans on Veterans Day. The room had gone very quiet. Even Karen's most vocal supporters seemed less certain now. Let's talk about those rules, David continued, opening his folder. According to the HOA bylaws, emergency meetings can only be called for genuine emergencies. Structural damage, safety hazards, legal threats to the community. Would you classify today's flower planting incident as a genuine emergency? It was a violation that needed immediate. It was a child trying to honor her dead father. David's voice cut through Karen's explanation like steel. And your response was to call the police and demand she be arrested. He pulled out a sheet of paper. This is Officer Martinez's incident report. Would you like me to read his observations about your behavior today? Karen's face paled. That's not necessary. Caller seemed more interested in escalating the situation than resolving it. David read aloud. Multiple witnesses reported inappropriate comments about the child's race and family background. Caller insisted on pressing charges despite no evidence of criminal activity. The room erupted in whispers. Several people were now looking at Karen with expressions, ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. That's taken out of context, Karen protested. I never said anything about race. I was talking about community standards. Community standards? David repeated. Like the standard that says grown adults don't call 911 on children. Like the standard that says we treat our neighbors with basic human decency? Stella Johnson stepped forward, her voice shaking with controlled emotion. Do you want to know what your community standards looked like to my 8-year-old niece? She came home crying, asking if she was a bad person, asking if her daddy would be ashamed of her for trying to plant flowers for him. The silence in the room was deafening. Even Karen's staunchest supporters were looking uncomfortable now. But let's talk about procedures, David continued, his voice returning to that deceptively calm tone. Since you're so concerned about following proper channels, Mrs. Whitfield, I have a few questions about tonight's meeting. He pulled out another document. According to Article 12 of the HOA bylaws, emergency meetings require notification to all board members at least 4 hours in advance. The silence that followed David's words was so complete that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. 60 pairs of eyes stared at him in shock, trying to process what they'd just heard. Karen Whitfield stood frozen at the front of the room, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, gasping for air. That's impossible, she finally whispered. You can't own an entire HOA. That's not how it works. David walked to the projection screen and calmly disconnected Karen's laptop, replacing it with his own. The first document that appeared made several people gasp audibly. Johnson Development Corporation. David read from the screen. Incorporated 1985. Principal owner? David Marcus Johnson. Primary asset? 247 acres of developed residential property in Millfield County, including all structures, common areas, and associated amenities. He clicked to the next slider, detailed property map showing every lot in Willowbrook Heights, all marked with the same owner designation. I bought this land in 1985 when I got out of the Army, spent 2 years getting permits, another 3 years building the first phase of homes. By 1990, I owned and operated a successful residential development with 43 custom homes. Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked as she spoke. But we bought our house from Millfield Realty. We have a deed. We own our property. You own your house, Mrs. Henderson. You own the structure and the lot it sits on, as outlined in your purchase agreement. But you don't own the common areas, the streets, the utilities, infrastructure, or the community amenities. Those belong to Johnson Development Corporation. They always have. David clicked to another document, the original community charter from 1987, when I decided to expand the development and bring in more residents. I needed a management structure, so I created the Willowbrook Heights HOA as a subsidiary organization to handle day-to-day operations, maintenance schedules, and community relations. He turned to face the stunned crowd. Every single one of you signed an agreement when you purchased your home. That agreement included a clause acknowledging that you were buying into a managed community overseen by Johnson Development Corporation. Bob Kramer stood up shakily. Are you saying we don't actually live in our own homes? You live in your homes, Mr. Kramer. You own your homes? But this community, the roads you drive on, the parks your children play in, the memorial garden, where my niece wanted to plant flowers, all of that belongs to me. The implications were sinking in now, and the mood in the room was shifting from confusion to something approaching panic. These people had built their identities around being part of an exclusive, self-governing community. The idea that they were essentially tenants in someone else's development was shattering their worldview. Why? Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice barely audible. Why didn't we know? Why did you let us think we had control? David's expression softened slightly. Because you do have control, Mrs. Henderson, within reason. The HOA board makes decisions about community policies, social events, minor maintenance issues. I never interfered because you were doing a good job managing yourselves. He gestured around the room. Most of you are good people. You care about this community. You want to maintain property values and create a safe, pleasant place to live. I respect that, and I've always tried to stay in the background and let you govern yourselves. Until today, Karen said, finding her voice again. Until you decided you didn't like the way we handled your precious niece. David turned his attention back to Karen, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. No, Mrs. Whitfield, until you decided to abuse your position, embezzle community funds, and terrorize a child. Until you turned a simple misunderstanding into a racist witch hunt. Until you forced me to choose between protecting my family and protecting your feelings. He clicked to a new slide, a detailed financial spreadsheet that made Karen go pale. Let's talk about your management, shall we? In the 18 months since you became treasurer, community funds have decreased by over $30,000. Maintenance requests have gone unfulfilled. Vendor payments have been delayed or denied. And somehow, your personal financial situation has improved dramatically. The spreadsheet showed a damning pattern: HOA expenditures that coincided exactly with Karen's credit card payments, cash withdrawals that matched her mortgage payments, and a series of consulting fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. You've been stealing from your neighbors, Mrs. Whitfield, using your position to line your own pockets while claiming to protect community standards. That's slander, Karen screamed. I'll sue you for every penny you have. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. With what money, Karen? With what authority? You're not just fired from the HOA board, you're banned from this community entirely. You can't ban me. I own property here. I have rights. You have the rights outlined in your purchase agreement, David said calmly, which includes a morality clause that allows for termination of residency in cases involving theft, harassment, or behavior detrimental to community welfare. He pulled out another document, Karen's original purchase agreement, with several sections highlighted in yellow. Section 15.3. Resident agrees to conduct themselves in a manner consistent with community values and neighborly respect. Section 15.7. Any resident found guilty of theft, fraud, or deliberate harm to other community members may be subject to immediate eviction. Karen's face had gone from red to white to a sickly green color. You can't evict me based on some trumped-up charges. I have a lawyer, I have connections. Do you? David asked mildly. Because according to my records, you're 3 months behind on your HOA dues, 2 months behind on your mortgage, and your homeowner's insurance lapsed last week. Your connections seem to have dried up right around the time you started stealing from the community fund. The crowd was watching this exchange like a tennis match, their heads turning back and forth between David and Karen, but the sympathy that might once have existed for Karen was long gone, replaced by anger and betrayal as they realized how she'd been manipulating and stealing from them. This is about race, Karen shouted desperately. He's playing the race card because he can't stand that I called out his family's behavior. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, and David's expression hardened into something that made several people step back involuntarily. My family's behavior? He repeated softly. You mean my niece trying to honor her father's sacrifice? My wife volunteering at the community food drive every month? My own service record 12 years in the army, 2 tours in Afghanistan? A bronze estar for valor? He stepped closer to Karen, who instinctively backed away. Or maybe you're talking about the fact that Maya is black, and you couldn't stand seeing a black child in your precious memorial garden. Maybe you're talking about the comments you made about people like us and our kind. Maybe you're talking about the fact that you saw a black family moving into your all-white neighborhood and decided we needed to be put in our place. I never said. Officer Martinez's report includes direct quotes, Mrs. Whitfield, along with witness statements from 6 different residents who heard every word you said, including your comment about better screening processes and maintaining community standards. David pulled out his phone and began reading from the screen. We can't just let anyone move in here and let their children run wild. People who don't understand our way of life, people who don't appreciate what we've built here. Each quote hit Karen like a physical blow, and she could see the disgust growing on the faces around her. You didn't just call the police on my niece, Karen. You tried to weaponize the entire community against my family. You turned neighbors into a mob and a child into a target, all because you couldn't stand the idea that we belonged here. The room was dead silent now, the weight of Karen's actions settling over everyone like a suffocating blanket. But here's the thing you never understood, David continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We don't just belong here, this is here. Every brick, every tree, every blade of grass. I didn't move into your community, Mrs. Whitfield. You moved into mine. He turned to address the room at large. All of you moved into mine. And you've been welcome here because you've been good neighbors. You've respected each other, helped each other, built something worth protecting together. His gaze swept across the crowd, making eye contact with face after face. But that welcome comes with expectations. It comes with the understanding that this is a community built on mutual respect and basic human decency. And when someone violates those principles, when someone turns neighbor against neighbor, when someone targets a child because of the color of her skin, David turned back to Karen, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd never had to raise it to command attention. That someone has to go. Karen looked around the room desperately, searching for support, for sympathy, for anyone who might stand up for her. But the faces staring back at her ranged from disgusted, to embarrassed, to openly hostile. Even her closest allies, Mrs. Henderson, the Morrison twins, Bob Kramer, were looking at her like she was a stranger. You can't do this, she whispered. This is America. You can't just kick people out because you don't like them. 3 weeks later, Maya Johnson knelt in the memorial garden with a small hand trowel, carefully placing bright orange marigold seedlings into the rich, dark soil. The November sun was warm on her back as she worked, her tongue poking out slightly, in concentration as she made sure each flower was perfectly positioned. "That one's for Daddy," she whispered to the first seedling, patting the earth gently around its roots. "And this one's for all the soldiers who can't come home." Behind her, a small crowd of neighbors watched in respectful silence. Mrs. Henderson held a watering can, waiting for Maya to finish so she could help tend the new additions. Bob Kramer had contributed a bag of mulch, and the Morrison twins, who hadn't spoken to each other in 12 years, but had somehow bonded over their shared shame, had donated a small bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson and all who served." David sat on a nearby bench, watching his niece work with quiet pride. 3 weeks had changed everything in Willowbrook Heights, but nothing had changed more dramatically than the community's relationship with the Johnson family. The same neighbors who had stood silent while Karen terrorized an 8-year-old were now fighting over who got to help with the memorial garden project. "Uncle David," Maya looked up from her planting, dirt smudged on her cheek. "Do you think Daddy would like the flowers?" "I think he'd love them, sweetheart, and I think he'd be very proud of you for never giving up on doing the right thing." Maya beamed and turned back to her work. Humming softly as she placed the last seedling, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with the watering can, and together they gave the new flowers their first drink in their new home. "Maya," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "I owe you an apology. What happened that day in the park, ... what I said and did. There's no excuse for it. You're a brave, good girl, and I'm sorry I didn't see that right away." Maya looked up at the older woman with the uncomplicated forgiveness of childhood. "It's okay, Mrs. Henderson. Uncle David says people sometimes make mistakes when they're scared or confused, but what matters is that they learn to do better." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "Your uncle is a very wise man, the wisest," Maya agreed solemnly, then brightened. "Do you want to help me plant the purple ones? Those are for all the families who missed their soldiers." As Maya and Mrs. Henderson worked together, David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and smiled grimly. The message was from his attorney. "Whitfield plea hearing concluded. All charges accepted. Restitution ordered. Case closed." The legal proceedings had moved faster than anyone expected. Karen's embezzlement of community funds was so blatant and well documented that her attorney had advised an immediate guilty plea. The harassment charges, based on Officer Martinez's report, had added additional leverage. In the end, Karen had agreed to full restitution, community service, an immediate vacation of the property, in exchange for avoiding jail time. But the real justice hadn't come from the courts. It had come from the community itself. David looked around the memorial garden, taking in the scene that would have been unimaginable just 3 weeks ago. Where once there had been a sterile, corporate-looking flower arrangement, there was now a living tribute that actually honored the memory of fallen soldiers. Where once there had been division and suspicion, there was now genuine community cooperation. "Mr. Johnson," a hesitant voice interrupted his thoughts. David looked up to see a young woman in her 30s approaching, a manila folder clutched in her hands. He recognized her as Jennifer Chen, the HOA vice president who had been traveling during Karen's emergency meeting. "Miss Chen, help you." Jennifer sat down beside him on the bench, looking nervous but determined. "I wanted to talk to you about the HOA structure, about what happens now that, ... well, now that we know the truth about who really owns the community." David studied her face, seeing genuine concern rather than the entitlement or fear he'd grown accustomed to from some residents. "What's on your mind?" "The truth is, we've been operating under false assumptions for years. We thought we were self-governing, but we weren't. We thought we had authority we didn't actually possess, and that led to what happened with your family." She opened the folder and pulled out a thick document. "I've been researching alternative community management structures, co-ops, community land trusts, resident-owned developments. I was wondering if you might be interested in exploring options that would give residents actual ownership and control over community decisions." David raised an eyebrow. This wasn't what he'd expected. "You want to buy the development?" "Not exactly, but I think there might be ways to restructure things so that residents have real power and real responsibility. Ways that would prevent another Karen Whitfield situation, while also giving people a genuine stake in the community they call home." She pulled out another document, a detailed proposal that clearly represented weeks of research and planning. "I know you didn't ask for this responsibility. You built a development and wanted to stay in the background while residents managed day-to-day operations. But what happened with Maya shows that our old system had serious flaws. Maybe it's time to try something new." David read through the proposal, impressed despite himself by the thoroughness and thoughtfulness of Jennifer's work. It outlined a gradual transition to resident ownership, with built-in protections against discrimination and abuse of power. "This is impressive work, Ms. Chen. But why come to me with this? Why not just accept the status quo?" Jennifer looked out at Maya, who was now showing Bob Kramer the proper technique for planting flower bulbs, while Mrs. Henderson and the Morrison twins watched with genuine interest, because that little girl deserves better than the status quo, because we all do. What Karen did was inexcusable, but it was also a symptom of a larger problem. We had a system that concentrated power in the hands of a few people with no real accountability. We had a community built on exclusion rather than inclusion. She turned back to David. You could have thrown us all out after what happened. You could have dissolved the HOA entirely and managed everything yourself. Instead, you gave us a chance to do better. I think we should take that chance. David was quiet for a long moment, watching his niece laugh as Bob Kramer accidentally got dirt on his nose. The old Bob, the one who had called Maya's behavior gang-like, was gone. In his place was a man who seemed genuinely delighted to be learning about gardening from an 8-year-old. There would be conditions, David said finally. Of course, real oversight, real accountability, and ironclad protections against discrimination of any kind. Absolutely. And Maya gets to plant flowers in that memorial garden whenever she wants. Jennifer smiled. I think that can be arranged. David stood up and extended his hand. Then let's talk about the details. As they shook hands, a commotion erupted. Near the garden entrance, David turned to see a small moving truck pulling away from 423 Maple Lane, Karen Whitfield's former address. The house looked strange with its windows bare and its perfectly manicured lawn already showing signs of neglect. Good riddance, someone muttered from the crowd around the garden. But David felt no satisfaction in Karen's departure. Her exile was necessary. There had been no way to rebuild community trust with her presence, poisoning every interaction. But it represented a failure as much as a victory. A failure to find common ground, to build bridges, to overcome the fear and ignorance that had turned neighbors into enemies. Uncle David. Maya appeared at his side, her small hand slipping into his. Are you sad about the mean lady moving away? David looked down at his niece, amazed as always by her emotional intelligence. A little bit, sweetheart. Not because I wanted her to stay, but because I wish things could have been different. Do you think she'll learn to be nicer in her new place? I hope so, Maya. I really do. Maya considered this with the seriousness of someone far older than her 8 years. Maybe she was just scared because she didn't understand that different families can be good neighbors too. Maybe so. Well, if she ever comes back to visit, I'll show her how pretty our flowers grew. Maybe that will help her understand. David squeezed his niece's hand, feeling a surge of love and pride that threatened to overwhelm him. After everything Karen had put her through, the humiliation, the fear, the confusion, Maya's first instinct was still compassion. You know what, sweetheart? I think your daddy would be very proud of the young lady you're becoming. Maya's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the whole neighborhood. Really? Really? And I think he'd be proud of these flowers too. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as neighbors who had been strangers 3 weeks ago worked side by side to water and tend the memorial garden. Mrs. Henderson was teaching the Morrison twins about proper mulching techniques. Bob Kramer was taking notes on plant spacing in a small notebook. Jennifer Chen was sketching ideas for additional memorial features in the margins of her community proposal. It wasn't perfect. There were still residents who participated only grudgingly, still conversations that died when David entered a room, still the occasional whispered comment or sideways glance. Changing hearts and minds was a slow process, and David knew there would be setbacks and challenges ahead. But it